Alright, so here we go.
Here, take a look back through history, and you'll find no shortage of famous figures who blur the boundaries between fact and fiction. Think Leonidas I of Sparta, or King Midas. Both were 100% real, but it's safe to say many of the stories surrounding them probably weren't. Most of these titans of times gone by only rose to true world fame after their tales were corrupted and endlessly embellished long after their deaths. But every once in a while, someone emerges from the haze of history whose dazzling deeds are so inexplicable, they become legends within their own lifetime. The subject of today's video is one such man, and his story is, quite simply, one of the most unbelievable I've ever shared on this channel. It's hard to know where to begin really, so how about some highlights? He was born a peasant, but rose to control the whole of Russia. He had the power to heal the sick, and the best doctors of his time couldn't explain how he did it. He survived multiple assassination attempts, including being poisoned, stabbed, and shot. He had the power of prophecy and made several bold predictions that subsequently came true. He slept with thousands of women despite never bathing. He brought down a 300-year-old royal dynasty almost single-handedly. And, most importantly of all, his pickled penis is preserved in a Russian museum to this day. This is the larger-than-life story of Grigori Rasputin, or, as I like to call him, the magical sex wizard who brought down the Russian monarchy. Now, I love food, and I wish I could sit down every morning for a lengthy breakfast, but by 9 AM, me up, it has everything and 24 grams of protein into your life. Did I mention it's also really is one of the most outlandish ever told? For sponsoring this video. Rasputin's story is one of the most outlandish ever told, but his beginnings are about as humble as it gets. He was born a peasant in 1869 in the tiny Siberian village of Pokrovsky. He had 7 siblings, but only Rasputin made it to adulthood. Very little is known about those early years beyond the fact that, like most of his peers, he received little in the way of education. It's likely he could neither read nor write until adulthood, and he was regularly in trouble with the local authorities thanks to a penchant for committing minor crimes and a major appetite for hard drink and soft women. By 18, he was married and would soon raise 3 children all of his own. So far, so utterly boring. At this point in our story, Rasputin's life wasn't all too dissimilar to thousands of other Russian men of the era. But in 1897, at the age of 28, he decided to take a pilgrimage to the St. Nicholas Monastery at Verkhoturya. It was a journey that would dramatically alter both his life and the course of Russian history. Rasputin wasn't an especially religious man prior to this pilgrimage, and his reasons for undertaking a 500-mile round trip in the name of a god that he wasn't all that well acquainted with are unknown. Some sources claim it was an excuse to make a swift exit from Pokrovsky after being caught stealing a horse, but I say that the heavy-drinking, wantonly womanizing Rasputin took the pilgrimage because lads' weekends hadn't been invented yet. Whatever the truth, when Rasputin returned some months later, he was a man transformed by religious fervor. Well, I say transformed. He still drank like a sailor and chased women night and day. He just did a lot more praying in his downtime. Over the following years, he travelled Russia extensively, styling himself as a wandering holy man. He also developed his own unique brand of religion built on the foundations of an outlawed Christian sect known as the Clists, whose murky practices were rumoured to include mass orgies and self-flagellation. Not at the same time. For his part, Rasputin preached that sin could only be overcome if it was first understood, which basically gave him free rein to do all the fun stuff in life in the name of theological research. He also taught that it was possible to get closer to God by achieving a state of sexual exhaustion, preferably by having as much sex as possible with Rasputin himself. Bearing in mind that he was one of the scariest looking individuals to ever have lived, and was famous for never washing and therefore smelt like a badger's arsehole, you might be surprised to learn that somehow this strange strategy for seducing women actually worked. Rasputin soon gathered a large number of followers, and there were growing whispers that during his time in the Siberian wilderness, he'd developed certain abilities. Some say he could read minds, others that he could heal the sick with the touch of his hand, and all agreed that there was something otherworldly about that man. By the early 1900s, he'd caused enough of a stir to attract the attention of several important people in the Russian Orthodox Church. Eventually, those lofty connections led him to St. Petersburg. Rasputin's arrival in the then Russian capital was perfectly timed. The city's aristocracy were positively obsessed with all things occult and supernatural. So when the badger-scented Siberian turned up amid rumours of magical powers in 1905, armed with a soul-piercing stare, everyone wanted a piece of him. He received invitations from many of the most influential and affluent families in the city. Rung by rung, he hauled himself up St. Petersburg's teetering social ladder until, in November 1905, he reached the final boss. He was invited to meet Tsar Nicholas II, Emperor of all of Russia and Patriarch of the centuries-old Romanov family, and his wife Alexandra Fyodorovna, the Tsarina. The encounter was planned for just a few minutes, but the self-proclaimed mystic worked his unique brand of black magic on the monarchs, and it was well over an hour before he emerged from the palace. It's often said that people believe what they want to believe, and that no doubt helped Rasputin win over the Russian royals. You see, the Tsar and Tsarina were absolutely desperate for the rumours about Rasputin to be true, because if he really could heal the sick, that meant he had the power to save their son, Alexei, who also happens to be heir to the entire Russian Empire. You see, Alexei suffered from haemophilia, a rare genetic disorder that prevents the blood from clotting properly. That might sound like a fairly minor ailment, but sufferers live their entire lives on a knife edge, where even a small injury can lead to devastating blood loss. Haemophilia is a serious illness even today, but in 20th century Russia, it was essentially a death sentence, the average life expectancy being just 13. Alexei was the youngest of 5 children, but since his elder siblings were all inconveniently female, the line of succession relied solely on his survival. In other words, if Rasputin could keep Alexei alive, he wasn't just saving the life of a treasured son, he was safeguarding the future of the entire Romanov dynasty. And it wouldn't be long before this holy man was given a chance to put his magic where his mouth was. As an interesting aside, at the time, haemophilia was so common amongst European royalty that it was often referred to as the royal disease. Historians have subsequently traced the rogue genes back to a single patient zero, none other than the so-called grandmother of Europe, Queen Victoria. She was a carrier, and her offspring spread haemophilia all around Europe's aristocracy, including the royal families of Spain, Germany, and Russia. Queen Victoria was Alexei Romanov's great-grandmother. Anyway, Rasputin was duly summoned to use his magic powers on the boy, and here's where things start to get a little weird. It's easy to dismiss Rasputin as a fraud, a charismatic chancer who somehow bluffed his way to the top, but whatever hocus-pocus he employed on the Russian heir, it actually worked. And not just once. Alexei's chief physician would later recall that whenever the boy was ill, Rasputin would turn up at his bedside, spit, and Alexei would recover in no time. In one of the more famous incidents, the prince suffered internal bleeding during a bumpy carriage ride back from a hunting trip. Before long, he'd fallen so gravely ill that a priest was summoned to perform his last rites, and a hasty telegram was penned announcing the boy's death to the world. Rasputin was back home in Siberia at the time, and the desperate Tsarina sent him a telegram of her own asking him to pray for her son. Despite being hundreds of miles away, Rasputin replied explaining that God had personally assured him the prince would live so long as no doctors interfered in his recovery. I don't know about you, but if I was a fraudulent faith healer, getting rid of everyone with a modicum of medical knowledge would be the last thing I'd do. Yet the Tsarina obliged, and against all common sense, Alexei began to recover almost immediately. Even today, more than 100 years later, nobody really knows exactly what Rasputin was doing to improve Alexei's health. It could be he was leveraging knowledge of internal bleeding cases in horses from his time in Siberia, whilst others believe his cures relied solely on some form of hypnosis. Still, others put his miraculous healing powers down to nothing more than simple psychology. By dismissing the prince's army of doctors and calming his mother's frayed nerves, Rasputin may simply have created a calmer, quieter atmosphere, more conducive to recovery. Add a powerful placebo effect into the mix, and who knows? If that's all a little vague for you, then don't worry, I have a slightly more concrete theory. Aspirin was a ubiquitous painkiller in Russia at the time, and would almost certainly have been prescribed for Alexei. But it turns out that aspirin thins the blood, and is basically oral kryptonite for haemophiliacs. That little medical factoid wasn't known to science until a good 50 years after Rasputin's death. But it may be that by regularly recommending Alexei's doctors be ignored in favour of the healing powers of God's grace, Rasputin was unwittingly protecting the prince from the harmful effects of ingesting aspirin. Of course, there's always the possibility that Rasputin really had gained magical healing powers by shagging his way around Russia and refusing to bathe, but I'm going to go ahead and put that one down as a long shot. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter how he was doing it. By ensuring blood flowed through the prince's veins, and more importantly keeping it there whenever he got so much as a paper cut, Rasputin gained the unshakable loyalty of the Tsar and Tsarina. Still, Rasputin wasn't one to take chances, and so to truly seal his position in the royal household, this big-dicked mystic made a prophecy, claiming that Rasputin wasn't one to take chances, and so to truly seal his position in the royal household, this big-dicked mystic made a prophecy, claiming that his destiny was linked with theirs, and that if anything untoward ever happened to him, the House of Romanov would fall. Again, it's easy to scoff at such an obvious ploy, except that prophecy would indeed later come true. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Tsar Nicholas II named Rasputin as his official lamplighter, a role which saw him look after the royal household's religious icons and gave him unparalleled access to Russia's rulers. Rasputin made the most of this position, and before long, he wasn't just healing Prince Alexei, he was advising on matters of state and influencing foreign policy. But his elevated status had done nothing to smooth Rasputin's rough manners, nor diminish any of his various appetites. Rumours abounded that the mystic would accept sexual favours and other bribes in return for putting in a good word with the Tsar and his wife, and when he couldn't get what he wanted by abusing his newfound power, he simply took it by force.
You guys know what this entails, right? I hate to be one of those guys who's like saying every word to the Titanic in the movie theater while you're sitting next to me and you're like, really, dude? But for any history buffs out there, you're looking at the start of World War I. And what would ultimately be the downfall. See, I already knew all this stuff. I like history. But yeah. What would it be the downfall of the Tsars? Or the Tsar?
That royal in question was known to his buddies as Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and unlike Rasputin, he didn't survive the hit. As you're no doubt aware, Franz Ferdinand's death set off a chain of events that culminated in the start of the First World War. In July 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, and Tsar Nicholas II left St. Petersburg to personally lead his troops on the battlefields of Europe, leaving only his wife behind to run the country. Alexandra had always been more swayed by Rasputin, and without her husband around, she gave her mind entirely to the mystic. within the space of 18 months, she'd appointed and dismissed no fewer than 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, and 3 ministers of war, with Rasputin guiding her hand at every turn.
It's not good.
It was soon an open secret on the streets of St. Petersburg that, along with accepting Rasputin's advice, the Tsarina had also invited him into her bed. Admittedly, there isn't any hard evidence that the affair ever happened, but considering how highly the Tsarina regarded Rasputin, not to mention that his religious ideology was to screw every living thing in Russia, it's difficult not to believe the rumours. There's also the fact that renowned scholar Boney M famously sang "Rah Rah Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen," and if that isn't proof, then I don't know what is. Regardless of whether or not they were actually sleeping together, Russia's greatest love machine had clearly become the true power behind the throne. The worm tongue to Alexandra's Theoden, but every worm tongue eventually meets his Gandalf, and in December 1916, a group of noblemen decided it was time to saddle up Shadowfax and go drive the demon out. They were led by Prince Felix Yusupov, husband of the Tsar's niece, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's first cousin, and prominent politician Vladimir Pereskovich. Of course, unlike Gandalf the Grey, none of these men actually had any magical powers, and so they were forced to choose a more prosaic approach. To save Russia, they were going to have to murder Grigori Rasputin. He was invited to Yusupov's palace in St. Petersburg, where he was taken to a receiving room in the basement. There, he was given tea and a platter of small cakes, which all sounds very civil as far as murders go, except the cakes were laced with cyanide. Rasputin was oblivious to the danger, and soon enough he was tucking into the poisonous pastries. But when he was finished, rather than, dropping dead, Rasputin merely asked if Yusupov had anything stronger than tea to wash down the cakes. Yusupov fetched some Madeira wine, also laced with cyanide, but despite guzzling 3 glasses, Rasputin didn't develop so much as a heartburn. To this day, we still have absolutely no idea how Rasputin ate enough cyanide to kill an entire village and survived. Though, in a very recent study, rats were fed both cyanide and garlic and survived. Turns out the sulfur content of garlic can combat cyanide in the body. And every day, Rasputin ate a frightening amount of garlic. Anyway, since the poison had failed to, poison him, Yusupov pulled out his pistol and shot Rasputin squarely in the chest. And that finally seemed to do the trick. Rasputin's body was stripped, and one of the co-conspirators drove to Rasputin's house wearing the dead man's clothes to make it look as though he'd returned home as planned. Next, it was time to dispose of the corpse. That was Yusupov's job. But when he went back down to the cellar, something rather unexpected happened. Rasputin stood up and punched him in the face. Yusupov fled the basement with a naked and very much not dead Rasputin in hot pursuit. A naked man running is never a pretty sight, and the bloody, grizzled Rasputin was no exception. But all commotion brought Yusupov's friends to the scene, and more shots were fired. When the smoke had cleared, Rasputin was once more on the ground, this time with a bullet through his forehead. It's safe to assume Yusupov and co were a little rattled at this point, so they spent the next few minutes kicking the crap out of the corpse, just to make sure it was really a corpse. Then they dumped the body in a nearby frozen river by way of a fishing hole. According to some reports, despite having been poisoned twice, shot multiple times, and beaten to a bloody pulp, Rasputin was still moving when he disappeared beneath the silent black water. He was found the following day, pressed up against the underside of the ice as though trying to break free, his still open eyes staring blankly up towards the sky. The Mad Monk was dead. Meanwhile, on the battlefields of Europe, things were going badly for the Russians. Nicholas II was turning out to be an absolutely useless military commander, and a series of serious tactical and logistical blunders saw his troops lose battle after battle. The situation back home wasn't much better either. The country had been crippled by the war effort. There was widespread hunger and discontent. Confidence in the monarchy was at an all-time low, and despite trying to hang on to power, in 1917, the Tsar was forced to abdicate when angry demonstrators took over large swathes of the capital, backed by members of the Russian armed forces. The 300-year rule of the Romanovs was at an end, and the Russian Revolution had begun. The Tsar and his family were held under house arrest, where they would remain for about a year, during which time the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized control of the Russian government. On the 17th of July, 1918, Bolshevik soldiers broke into a basement where the Romanovs were being held and started firing. They didn't stop until the former Tsar and Tsarina, and every single one of their children, were dead. At the start of this video, I mentioned that Rasputin was a man who blurred the lines between myth and reality, and there are certainly many aspects of this tale that stretch credulity. Certain elements are widely accepted fact. Rasputin really did rise from nothing to have a huge influence over the Russian monarchy, and he certainly played a large role in its eventual downfall. But others are contested. Some historians believe details of Rasputin's debaucherous lifestyle were exaggerated in order to discredit him, and it's a fairly safe bet that the events of his murder have been spiced up a little bit. Oh, and for those of you still wondering when the hell I'm going to get to Rasputin's penis, don't worry, the wait is over. The fate of Rasputin's pecker remains a surprisingly hot topic even now. According to one story, it was removed not long after his death under orders from Grand Duchess Tatiana, daughter of the Tsar, who was one of the many women claimed to have been raped by the mystic. As of today, you can find pickled penises purported to belong to Rasputin in multiple museums all over Russia. Of course, there is a slight logical fallacy with that statement. Despite his reputation as a lover of epic proportions, so far as I know, God only gave Rasputin one penis with which to do his holy work. Over the years, several of the appendages have been tested to determine their provenance. At least one turned out to be a sea cucumber, and another, a 12-inch behemoth of frankly frightening proportions, was found to have belonged not to Rasputin, but to a poorly endowed horse. The truth is, whilst it's still widely reported that Rasputin's penis was severed after his death, like so many things about his life, this one's probably just a myth. We know for certain that the offending appendage was still attached during the autopsy, and there's no evidence it was later removed. By most accounts, Grigori Rasputin was a pretty terrible human being, but his story really is fascinating. And if nothing else, it remains proof of something many of us have suspected for a long time. That you don't need to have good personal hygiene to go far in life. Thanks for watching.